Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what is becoming one of the most fascinating and potentially damaging developments of the war in Ukraine for Russia. For the last 4 years, we've talked about sanctions, oil revenues, inflation, interest rates, labour shortages, military spending, and budget cuts. But over the last few weeks, we've started seeing something very different. We're now seeing the war directly impacting on one of the most important sectors of the Russian economy: fuel. And the reason this story is so important is because Russia isn't just a large producer of oil and gasoline. Russia is one of the biggest energy exporters in the world. Now, before we get into the details of all of this, if you're new to the channel, could I ask you to subscribe, please? I spend a lot of time researching what's happening inside Russia and Ukraine and looking at the economic consequences that don't often make the headlines. So if you enjoy this sort of analysis and these sort of videos and want to stay up to date with the latest developments, then please hit that subscribe button. It also helps the channel with the algorithm and puts a smile on my face. So when headlines start appearing that Russia is now preparing to import gasoline because it can't produce enough itself, that is a major event. And it's happening because Ukraine has changed the way battle is operating. This war is increasingly becoming a drone war, and Russia is finding that defending thousands of potential targets across the world's largest country is becoming incredibly difficult. Multiple reports coming out of Russia say that it's now importing gasoline by sea because domestic supplies have become so tight. Industry sources state that cargoes of gasoline are arriving through Russia's western ports from Asia in what is an extremely unusual move for the world's major fuel exporter. If you just think about that for a moment, Russia is the world's largest producer of oil and exporting huge amounts of crude oil around the globe. It's exporting vast quantities of refined fuel products. Well, it would be in normal circumstances, and it earns a huge proportion of its foreign currency revenues from energy. But it's now finding itself in a situation where it's having to import gasoline, which is really quite remarkable. And the reason for this is very straightforward. Ukraine has spent months systematically targeting Russia's energy infrastructure: oil refineries, storage depots, fuel terminals, distribution hubs, pipelines, and the objective was simple: to reduce Russia's ability to generate revenue and make it harder for the country to support its military operations. And the strategy looks to be working. Russia's gasoline production has fallen significantly over the past few months compared with where it was last year due to repeated refinery disruptions caused by those drone attacks. And that's creating a problem at exactly the wrong time from Russia's point of view, because summer demand is rising. Lots of people are traveling for tourism and other activities. Agricultural activity is increasing. Russia produces a huge amount of produce. The military continues to require enormous quantities of fuel to keep the war in Ukraine going. And at the same time, refining capacity is being disrupted. The situation has become serious enough that Russia has already introduced a number of emergency measures. Back in April, the government banned gasoline exports until the end of July in an attempt to protect domestic supplies. I think where we are right now, it's likely that that ban will be extended. If you just think about how extraordinary that sequence of events has become, Russia has banned the export of gasoline. I mean, that's one of its biggest profit earners, because you earn more money from refined products than you do from just selling the raw material crude oil. We've now got shortages continuing in Russia itself. Fuel stations across the country are restricting sales or actually running out of fuel completely. Rationing appears to be causing major problems with people's mindset. So we're seeing lots of people filling up their cars more often and panic buying and big queues at stations that still have fuel. And now Russia is having to import gasoline. And that's not a situation that anybody would have expected at the start of this war, which, let's remember, President Putin thought was going to last for a few days. We're already starting to see the impact on ordinary Russian citizens. Earlier this month, panic buying broke out in parts of southern Russia that were concerned about future shortages. In Crimea, motorists have faced restrictions and supply problems following repeated attacks on fuel infrastructure and transport routes. And now the situation has escalated further, with fuel sales to members of the public effectively being halted in parts of Crimea, with available supplies being prioritised for the military and government use. And this is the sort of issue that quickly becomes visible in everyday life. Motorists start encountering long queues, filling stations begin running low on supplies, prices start going higher. Recently, it's reported that a station in Crimea increased its price by 19% overnight. That makes journeys much more difficult to plan for Russians. And once that starts happening, confidence begins to suffer because people can see with their own eyes that something isn't working. And that's why this has become more than just an economic issue. It's increasingly becoming a morale issue in Russia. One of the most interesting aspects of this story is where these attacks are now taking place. At the start of the war, most Russians viewed the conflict as something that was happening hundreds or probably thousands of miles away from where they were living. It was distant, something on the news, on television, and something that was affecting other people. That situation has changed dramatically over the past few months. Ukraine is repeatedly targeting infrastructure in and around Moscow itself. This week, Ukrainian drones struck Moscow's main refinery once again. And that's significant because this facility supplies a large proportion of the fuel used in the capital of the country. And beyond the operational disruption, there's also a psychological impact. Moscow is around 500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. In miles, that's around 350 miles. So we're no longer talking about attacks close to the front line. We're talking about attacks deep inside Russia, in the capital city itself. We're talking about explosions, fires, and disruptions taking place in the political and economic heart of the country. And that changes the perception of this war because suddenly the war no longer feels distant. Now let's talk about the production and supply of drones because this is another fascinating part of the story. The United Kingdom has just announced another major support package for Ukraine, which includes 150,000 drones. That is a big number. And this comes on top of the previous drone commitments already given by the UK. Across Europe, there's an increasing focus on drone warfare. Germany has significantly expanded its support for Ukrainian domestic drone production capabilities. France is involved in a number of collaborative defence programmes focused on drones and advanced military technology. Several Nordic countries have also increased support for drone procurement and production, and Ukraine itself is dramatically increasing domestic manufacturing. In fact, it's one of the world's biggest drone manufacturers right now. This is no longer a situation where a handful of drones are launched against isolated targets. We're increasingly seeing swarm attacks involving hundreds of drones operating simultaneously. Russia has recently claimed that it intercepted more than 500 drones during a single large-scale attack. That is a huge scale. Whether that number is entirely accurate doesn't really matter, but it demonstrates the scale of what is now taking place. And this creates a massive problem for Russia. How do you defend everything in the country? Russia is the world's largest country geographically. It has thousands of miles of pipelines, dozens of major refineries, almost 50, hundreds of fuel storage facilities, power stations, chemical plants, military bases, rail hubs, airfields, ports, airports, factories, government buildings, the list goes on. And every single one of those locations is a potential drone target. You can't place sophisticated air defense systems everywhere. It's impossible. Even if you did, the cost would be absolutely astronomical. And that's why we've started seeing alternative solutions. Some refineries have begun installing protective netting and physical barriers, but that takes time, it's expensive, and it requires maintenance, and it can only be deployed at a limited number of locations. Ukraine only needs to get through occasionally. Russia has to defend successfully every single time. And that asymmetric aspect of this war is increasingly defining the conflict. A relatively inexpensive drone can now threaten infrastructure worth billions of dollars. A swarm attack costing a fraction of the value of the target can cause significant disruption, and that's exactly what we're now seeing. The economic consequences are becoming increasingly visible. Fuel prices have been rising faster than overall inflation. Some independent fuel stations are increasing their prices, I mentioned earlier, following recent disruptions. Authorities have been forced to intervene repeatedly in the market. There have even been reports suggesting that some fuel quality requirements have been relaxed in order to maximise available supplies. Again, these are not the actions of a country comfortably sitting on an energy surplus. These are the actions of a country attempting to manage an increasingly difficult situation. And perhaps the biggest irony of all of this is that the sectors now experiencing some of the greatest disruption are the most important sectors in the entire Russian economy: oil, fuel, energy, the industries that generate a huge proportion of Russia's revenues, the industries that help fund government spending and are helping funds support the military expenditure for the war in Ukraine. These industries for decades have been Russia's economic strength. Today they are under sustained attack. Exports have been banned, production is being disrupted, shortages are now appearing, rationing is being applied in regions, and Russia is preparing to import gasoline for one of the first times in its history. That is a really extraordinary headline, and it demonstrates just how much warfare is changing. The battlefield is no longer confined to trenches and tanks. It now extends deep into economic infrastructure. It extends into supply chains, refineries, fuel depots, and everyday life for Russians. As Ukraine continues to expand its drone capabilities and receives additional support from Western allies, the pressure on Russia's energy sector is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. The question now is whether this remains a temporary disruption or whether it evolves into a much larger structural problem for an economy that remains heavily dependent on energy revenues, because this is no longer just about military operations. This is now about the functioning of the Russian economy itself. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. Really does help to keep me focused and making as many videos as possible.